Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the second chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. These are the circumstances in general connected with the aim which we have to pursue in war. Let us now turn to the means. There is only one single means, it is the fight. However diversified this may be in form, however widely it may differ from a rough vent of hatred and animosity in a hand-to-hand encounter, whatever number of things may introduce themselves which are not actual fighting, still it is always implied in the conception of war that all the effects manifested have their roots in the combat. That this must always be so in the greatest diversity and complication of the reality is proved in a very simple manner. All that takes place in war takes place through armed forces, but where the forces of war, for example, armed men, are applied, there the idea of fighting must of necessity be at the foundation. All, therefore, that relates to forces of war, all that is connected with their creation, maintenance, and application belongs to military activity. Creation and maintenance are obviously only the means, whilst application is the object. The contest in war is not a contest of individual against individual, but an organized whole consisting of manifold parts. In this great whole we may distinguish units of two kinds, the one determined by the subject, the other by the object. In an army the mass of combatants ranges itself always into an order of new units, which again form members of a higher order. The combat of each of these members forms, therefore, also a more or less distinct unit. Further, the motive of the fight. Therefore, its object forms its unit. Now, to each of these units which we distinguish in the contest, we attach the name of combat. If the idea of combat lies at the foundation of every application of armed power, then also the application of armed force in general is nothing more than determining and arranging a certain number of combats. Every activity in war, therefore, necessarily relates to the combat either directly or indirectly. The soldier is levied, clothed, armed, exercised, he sleeps, eats, drinks, and marches, all merely to fight at the right time and place. If, therefore, all the threads of military activity terminate in the combat, we shall grasp them all when we settle the order of the combats. Only from this order and its execution proceed the effects, never directly from the conditions preceding them. Now, in the combat all the action is directed to the destruction of the enemy, or rather his fighting powers. For this lies in the conception of combat. The destruction of the enemy's fighting power is therefore always the means to attain the object of the combat. This object may likewise be the mere destruction of the enemy's armed force. But that is not by any means necessary, and it may be something quite different. Whenever, for instance, as we have shown, the defeat of the enemy is not the only means to attain the political object, whenever there are objects which may be pursued as the aim in a war, then it follows of itself that such other objects may become the object of particular acts of warfare, and therefore also the object of combats. But even those combats which, as subordinate acts, are in the strict sense devoted to the destruction of the enemy's fighting force, need not have that destruction itself as their first object. If we think of the manifold parts of a great armed force, of the number of circumstances which come into activity when it is employed, then it is clear that the combat of such a force must also require a manifold organization, a subordinating of parts and formation. There may and must naturally arise, for particular parts, a number of objects which are not themselves the destruction of the enemy's armed force, and which, while they certainly contribute to increase that destruction, do so only in an indirect manner. If a battalion is ordered to drive the enemy from a raising ground or a bridge, etc., then properly the occupation of any such locality is the real object, the destruction of the enemy's armed force, which takes place only the means or secondary matter. If the enemy can be driven away merely by a demonstration, the object is attained all the same, but this hill or bridge is, in point of fact, only required as a means of increasing the gross amount of loss inflicted on the enemy's armed force. It is the case on the field of battle. Much more must it be so on the whole theatre of war, where not only the army is opposed to another, but one state, one nation, or one whole country to another. Here the number of possible relations and consequently possible combination is much greater. The diversity of measures increased, and by the gradation of objects each subordinate to another the first means employed is further apart from the ultimate object. It is therefore for many reasons possible that the object of a combat is not the destruction of the enemy's force, that is, of the force immediately opposed to us, but that this only appears as a means. But in all such cases it is no longer a question of complete destruction, for the combat is here nothing else but a measure of strength, has in itself no value except only that of the present result, that is, of its decision. But a measuring of strength may be effected in cases where the opposing sides are very unequal by a mere comparative estimate. In such cases no fighting will take place, and the weaker will immediately give way. If the object of a combat is not always the destruction of the enemy's forces therein engaged, and if its object can be often be attained as well without the combat taking place at all, by merely making a resolve to fight and by the circumstances to which this resolution gives rise, then that explains how a whole campaign may be carried on with great activity without the actual combat playing any notable part in it. That this may be so military history proves by 100 examples. How many of those cases can be justified, that is, without involving a contradiction, and whatever some of the celebrities who rose out of them would stand criticism, we shall leave undecided, for all we have to do with the matter is to show the possibility of such a course of events in war. So, in this passage, von Clausewitz offers us a conceptual understanding of the means in war, which is particularly important because we're still at the beginning of the work. The author will go progressively more in depth, looking at how war is effectively waged and how it is even to feel, to stay on a battlefield and all this stuff. But here it's very important to basically get rid of any kind of misconception that lays at the root of the theory of war. That is particularly important because I would say that even considering Schwerpunkt and its main objective, really the greater problems do not really lay in misunderstanding of military history and politics in general, in the details. I mean, every person is able to go out there and read something, right, that is detailed. The real problem is to understand how the whole thing really is about, and didactically speaking, it would be more useful to start actually from this more general fundamentals, these essentials that you have never to forget, because they're effectively the ones that are gonna dictate how the whole system works, and then progressively descending into detail, and therefore acquiring another form of experience that, however, has always to bear in mind this roughly, theoretical but at the same time existing in reality spectrum, this system. So here it gets von Clausewitz gets as effective as it can be. There is only one single means in war, that is the fight. And he tells us that however diversified fight may be in its form, So however widely it may differ from a rough vent of hatred and animosity, or in a hand-to-hand encounter, whatever number of things may introduce themselves which are not actual fighting, still it is always implied in the conception of war that all the effects manifested have their roots in the combat. So even if, as we have seen now from the first chapter and also in this one, having started it, how many elements come to alterate, to mitigate, to condition that original abstract ideal, or idea even better, of war, still really this is a fight, and this never, and you can't escape from this in a way or in another. So it really doesn't matter how this is manifested, really, because it's as if it was blended with other elements, but still it's really really there, and it's all the effects manifested have their roots in this combat, right? So that, and von Clausewitz insists in here, because it says sometimes it may appear not to be really so. I mean, even if, and we'll clarify it later, observing how, certain things, it's not even about, certain times it's not even about clashing with the enemy directly, but maybe seizing a position that will entail, but it's still part of the wall of the fight. And then in all these various streams in which it gets apparently astray from the original direction, from the most reasonable idea of war, still that's really the driving factor. That's really what the current is pushing towards. And he says then that this must always, so that there is only one single means in war, that is the fight. This must always be in the greatest diversity and complication of the reality, and it is proved in a very simple manner. So all that takes place in war takes place through armed forces. But where the forces of war, for example, armed men, are applied, there the idea of fighting must, of necessity, be at the foundation, right? So we're not talking, you can interpret this you can't really interpret this more than much, but the concept in here is that here's reminding us about the humanity of the stuff, right? So that feeling of hatred and animosity and enmity, etc., is still what moves the whole system. When we talk about armed forces, we talk about war, we talk about an act of violence. So this is performed as an instrument, in fact. But this instrument is, you consider also what forces they're moving, and these forces are armed men, right? So the idea of fighting is something that goes beyond even the system in itself. The system is animated. It has a capacity to keep fueling this sense of these forces they're both moral and physical at the same time. They are connected to the fight, to the idea that there is an enemy to overthrow, right? And the way it's as if this varied in all from every man, actually, and from any second, right? But it's still determined by it, and that's why this could open very interesting considerations about things like artificial intelligence, etc. Because many people would say, well, but then you see you have a machine that works by itself. Yes, but the machine is being created exactly to do something that has to do with that fight by people, actually. And aside from the fact that I'm extremely skeptical that we will ever manage to create or reproduce something that works like a human mind, artificially speaking, but that would still be trying basically to approach that kind of level. So actually the Clausewitzian paradigm is it's really I wouldn't say metaphysical, because obviously it takes into consideration very physical and very material and real things, but it kind of goes beyond of every single uh, you know in war, and not only because, as we've seen, it goes beyond even in politics, looking at politics and society, but it goes beyond all these various and of this greatest diversity and complication of the reality, he has just called it right now. So that it doesn't matter how the instrument differs in its practice, in its employment, in its use, but it's still about the fight, and that's fundamentally where the whole thing revolves around. So this is to be remembered. So then he goes on and says, all therefore that relates to forces of war, all that is connected with their creation, maintenance, and application belongs to military activity. So these forces that are armed men, right, that have to be in this sense created as armed men and then maintained as such and applied, really belongs to the military activity. So when we study, to make it simple, what we study military history, we're fundamentally studying this, right, in a way or in another, because we can naturally study elements that seem to be, I don't know, maybe more technological, more mechanical, as we were saying before with the example of artificial intelligence, but it doesn't matter, because still the whole thing is pushed by the fight, and that's what we study, why we study something that is called war in the first place, without which there wouldn't be any, Okay, let's stop it here for now, because otherwise it goes too repetitive in some way. But and here he also distinguishes pretty clearly, but that tells you how von Clausewitz really proceeds step by step. It doesn't make you miss any single element for going on in his logical chain. He says creation and maintenance are obviously only the means, whilst application is the object, right? So the application at least has to do with the using in fact the application of the same means, but aimed at something, at some purpose. So and that obviously we will see now has makes really the big difference. Not only it's not really the prevalent factor, but you have an object that you're pursuing. So if you didn't have that, well, the rest wouldn't follow. You wouldn't need to arm someone. You really need to try to find the means to do it, etc. So that's still the element that reigns sovereign from politics on the military instrument, right? So going on, von Clausewitz says that the contest in war is not a contest of individual against individual, but an organized whole consisting of manifold parts. So stopping here for a moment, that this is already extremely interesting for whoever wants to approach military history, even just essentially and conceptually. There is a great I stop here because I notice, as I often say, that the general approach to of the I wouldn't say even the average person to military history at the beginning it's somewhat, however, I believed usually or tendentially unbalanced, especially when it gets kind of technical, to the individual side of combat, right? The individual side of combat proper, not even of the fight. And here von Clausewitz is reminding, so that just to make a banal example, that you remember my invectives against those approaches that start chiefly from I don't know, maybe from the armament, saying how many times you've read, if you are interested in military history, and search for some YouTube video that talks about it, what kind of questions like what kind of weapon would I use to fight this kind of enemy. That is typical, because the idea is it's not really, maybe I always try to explain that with the technologistic prejudice that definitely exists, and much more than it should, but it's really probably something that goes beyond that. Here von Clausewitz is pointing out, that is considering especially this individual dimension of the fight, like I don't know whether this is really automatically or I believe it is actually that the individual man tends instinctively at least to focus on the individual perspective. Like, what can I do as a single individual? How can I cope with that situation from my perspective? Because it's right, it's instinct of survival, of self-preservation. So it's perfectly normal. But then it expands, because obviously there are many factors to be considered, especially in wars that are fought by at least more than just one guy versus the other, right? And there things get complicated, and because you have to be able to abstract from the individual without obviously losing him losing sight of him in this sense, but also starting to expand on collective dynamics, like how do what you were trying to explain often on Schwerpunkt, how do human groups fight in fact in groups, right? And this is complicated. This requires rationality. It requires something that goes beyond what is the individual range that we're instinctively limited to, right? So here, if you're already well into military history, it may sound maybe just naive that von Clausewitz is pointing out, but that war is not a contest, or better, that the contest in war is not a contest of individual against individual, right? But it's so extremely important to remember in the first place, because many people tend to skip that. They tend to think that all that matters starts just from the tiny guy, which is actually, in the Clausewitzian theory, this finds its place in the sort of domino effect when it comes to attrition and the fog of war, in that even a very small thing can cause a mess as a reflection. Think about theory of chaos and all this stuff. So it's still important, but still here von Clausewitz is interested in the practical side of the story. So he's not telling that the detail cannot influence the bigger thing, but at the same time, just mathematically, it's less frequent than a bigger decision who is in command can influence the whole, and still, in terms of, in fact, just in problems of command, it's still who is at the top who has to deal with this, with a broader view, a broader understanding of these systems, and that's why that requires a freaking lot of intelligence and rationality that is usually required to military commanders, and not to the individual soldier that is mostly to be trained, even in a sort of instinctive way, to react like a reflex in order to do that mechanic that can save his life on the field. But when it comes to much more complex systems, I'm not saying that individual combat is not, because it's actually dramatically something that requires a lot of intelligence in itself, but you can imagine how that complicated it goes in other circumstances, even at in the higher ranks. So the point in here is that when you lead an army and you take a decision in general, you can't reason. Even if you were an individual soldier, you can't take a decision like just step by step most of the times. You have to reasoning like a bot. You have to have a sort of longer grasp of the situation, and therefore you have to go beyond the individual side of the story, right? So in fact here von Clausewitz stress beautifully that the contest in war is an organized whole, consisting of manifold parts. Then he says, in this great whole we may distinguish units of two kinds, the one determined by the subject and the other by the object. So we have seen before, so this comes again, but we have encountered the two phrases before when he says that basically, or one phrase before actually, maintenance and application, that creation and maintenance obviously pertain to the means, and therefore there is a sort of, voicing a subjectivity entailed by using them, and then the object that at that point requires the application of those means, right? So here, subjectivity and objectivity are kind of reflected in part by this, because then he explains, in an army, the mass of competence arranges itself always into an order of new units, right? Which again form members of a higher order. So, in other words, every single combatant is part of the armed force that in this sense are influenced by the relation that exists between the subject and the object, right? There is if you think in the terms of action and reaction in some way, which is very physical. Maybe it's not and definitely mechanical. So it doesn't help you to understand the actual, even intellectual process that it takes to react orderly, or at least with a certain aim, right? It's not mere physical reaction. It's way more than that. So, but they still are part of all these units are part of a higher order, right? So a order that corresponds even to hierarchies, if you want, that has commander-in-chief that has to take into account basically all of these units and dealing with them and working with them. Then von Clausewitz says the combat of each of these members forms therefore also a more or less distinct unit. So that this can get down up to the individual soldier, right? Every soldier is doing. Remember when von Clausewitz at the very beginning of the Vom Kriege says that war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. Well, this is exactly what this phrase means. That you essentially, war doesn't differ much in nature from a duel. It's the same exact thing. So what these units here has been talking about in terms of subject and an object are replicating themselves and evolving and changing and modifying constantly at all of these levels, right? And they can be analyzed even singularly, right? So it's on those units that if you were to focus just on an individual level, you would still have to think it, so that it's not a mechanic thing for which you can say, which kind of weapon do I need to use now to win? That can help you, but it's not the same thing. It's not otherwise there wouldn't be any probability, right, to calculate. We would already know everything. And instead, this doesn't happen, and this is also what fluidifies war, because if you remember in the first chapter, von Clausewitz explains quite clearly that if we were to know scientifically what a clash would turn out at every time, there wouldn't be even a war in the first place, because everybody would simply say, okay, I already know how it's going to end, I'm not going to try it. There would be an immediate freezing and crystallization of the system, and it's impossible. It's against our cognitive. I mean, it doesn't simply lay into a reality, right? So then he goes on and says, now to each of these units which we distinguish in the contest, we attach the name of combat, right? So combat effectively describes these units. What is these units that have to do with the subject and the object? It's combat, nothing else. And it's interesting because combat has this reciprocity for which there is a unit that you can't see both from the side of one combatant and one from the other, right? It's still the same thing. There is a subject from both sides and there is an object for both sides at least. And that's what combat is, basically. And how it's regulated, how these interactions really take place. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, if the idea actually of combat lies at the foundation of every application of armored power, then also the application of armored force in general is nothing more than determining and arranging of a certain number of combats. Now, this is particularly important because, once again, he gives you a scale perspective, right? He tells you, if the idea of combat lies at the foundation of every application of armored power, that is, you can't use the military instrument if you don't have this subjective perception in an object that you want to achieve. Then also the application of the armored force in general, that is to say, using your army, your military in general, even just maybe not as an option still, right? Because it's still the policy that decides that, right? You have the military in your pocket. When you use it or not, it's your choice, right? So this choice is based, I'm kind of paraphrasing, maybe going a bit beyond here, but the concept is this one, is that even the application of armored force, that is that choice, is nothing more than the determining and arranging of a certain number of combats. That is to say, even if I will actually not come to combat, because it happens frequently, I still have to take into consideration previously, there is even a temporal dimension into here. There is a before and afterwards, because you organize, you create your armored forces, you maintain your armored forces, and you're basically just, as we will see now in a few phrases, just to bring this armored forces to fight at the right time and place. So there is going from A to B, right? So you don't really know what will happen when you arrive to B, not even if you will arrive in there. But still, you have to have thought at the idea of getting into combat in the first place, because that's essentially what the unit is all about. Because it's the subject and the object, the subject thinking the object and preparing from the object and moving from the object. Right? So in this sense, the certain number of combats is not just what you're expecting, but also what you already know has happened for example, in the military theory. You have to determine and arrange these combats on a pre-existing knowledge, acknowledgement of how war basically works. So every activity, then he goes on and says, every activity in war therefore necessarily relates to the combat either directly or indirectly. Yes, so we'll see now more precisely what it means. But we already said it just in the previous phrase, right? Right, in the previous phrase, you can think of this, well, not quite, this is a different concept he introduced. It's basically saying that you can achieve combat in different ways, or better, you can picture the fight in two directions that take into consideration different combinations of combat that also entail the outcome of the fight in itself. So then he says, the soldier is levied, clothed, armed, exercised, he sleeps, eats, drinks, and marches, all merely to fight at the right time and place. Alright, so and I would say he also yeah, okay, this is good just in absolute terms, but you understand that there is no, the whole objective basically of military preparation is the fight. This is the great importance of this phrase, that there is no other reason for which you decide to use violence, or better, to prepare for violence, if you do not preemptively take into consideration its use, at least, and in the degree in which it has to be used, because naturally your preparations have to do with how you can handle the instrument and how well you can use it, how many energies you need for it. So this is, let's repeat it because it's very punching as a phrase. Every activity in war therefore necessarily relates to the combat either directly or indirectly. The soldier is levied, clothed, armed, exercised. He sleeps, eats, drinks, and marches, all merely to fight at the right time and place. Very, very clear. If, therefore, going on, all the threads of military activity terminate in the combat, we shall grasp them all when we settle the order of the combats. So, this is what we have just said. That is, if you expect to fight, you have to expect also what all of this entails, not just as consequences, but naturally how you get there to it. So, when you, this is particularly important when you plan an operation, right? You have to settle the order of the various combats, of the various units of subject and object, which is to say that think about organic and also the relative chain of command. That is logically built according to the idea that basically at every unit level, the unit commander has to act in a certain way, and also with a certain degree of autonomy, of course. So the idea is that the way we organize our military systems take into consideration that obviously from the top you can't really know about everything, you really can't deal with every single fight, but that at a unit level, for chain of command, there has to be an officer that takes the necessary decision to cope with that enemy. And in spite all of these combats are not to be dealt with by, given at least the limits of possibility, or because that can happen. Think about a small operation, right? That can be controlled even by a general. With all technology we have, it's perfectly possible if it's a contained operation. But still, these units have to act alone in the way they subjectively determine their objective. And that is I know it sounds very theoretical, but it's of dramatic importance into military history because, by the way, from the same Clausewitzian theory, there were military systems like the Prussian one that eventually defeated the French in 1871, is that that there has to be a degree of autonomy given to the officers. That is to say, you can't truly pretend. This is a great problem now. I would have to open a huge digression on kind of 80 years of military history, but that's particularly important because there should be a sort of balance between what you can control from the top of all these units, of all of these combats, and what is, also the attainment of the main objective, that from the highest ranks, let's say, even from by political mandate at the point of commander-in-chief, you have to do with a military instrument. So it's particularly important. And when you plan an operation, that's what you do. You have to take into consideration that along the way, your units will encounter those dynamics, right? So it's still part of your strategical concerns to maybe take into account what can happen, say, I don't know, at a platoon level or a company level or at the division level. Still, there is a degree of this that is left to to degree of autonomy to the local commander, right? I mean, local commander. What the hell am I saying? And say to the officer in charge. And then von Clausewitz continues, only from this order of the combats and its execution proceed the effects, never directly from the conditions preceding them. And so this also tells you how much depends actually on what happens at a lower rank, right? Now, then he says, now in the combat, all the action is directed to the destruction of the enemy, or rather, of his fighting powers. For this lies in the conception of combat. So this is also particularly important because it says that all the action in combat is directed to the destruction of the enemy, right? Or rather, more precisely, of his fighting powers. That is to say, and we will see now, you don't really have to aim at the destruction of the physical annihilation of the enemy, right? So, but just of his capability of fighting. For this lies in the conception of combat. Then goes on and says, the destruction of the enemy's fighting power is therefore always the means to attain the object of combat, right? So there is no way out of this. You have with the destruction of the enemy's fighting power, the mean to attain the object of the combat. So you can't really escape from this dynamic. It's always how it really works. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, this object may likewise be the mere destruction of the enemy's armed force. May. As we were saying before, it's not necessary. In fact, says, but that is not by any means necessary, and it may be something quite different. Whenever, for instance, as we have shown, the defeat of the enemy is not the only means to attain the political object. He's referring to last video, to the passage we talked about the last video. Whenever there are other objects which may be pursued at the aim in a war, then it follows of itself that such other objectives may become the object of particular acts of warfare, and therefore also the object of combats, right? So in other words, you don't really have, and we'll see now with an example, a few time at hand now, how this can happen. You don't really have necessarily to kill the enemy to achieve a degree of, of destroying the enemy's combatant capabilities, right? Fighting capabilities. You can achieve it through other ways that, however, are still all comprehended in the object of combat, because that's what it's gonna bring to the destruction of the enemy's fighting powers. And so it even says of let's say you can give a good idea that the object of particular acts of warfare. So there are different actions fundamentally that bring you to destroy the enemy fighting power without actually clashing, just like 1 versus 1. It's important to insist on this because that's the same old story of all those questions like, just imagine that you have, I don't know, 1,000 soldiers equipped with that weapon on a flat ground so that everything is equal, it's even, because the abilities are all the same. From the other side, you have other 1,000 men that win with that particular weapon. Who wins? Well, that's not real. That's not the point of combat in the first place, but it's not because you can't approximate a combat to such a relative conditions, but simply because the combat in itself has to do with tons of other factors that can't be ignored in that system unless you dehumanize that. And there you're talking about something that doesn't exist, but that couldn't really even exist. It doesn't even approach to reality. And that's why when you have these approximations, like for instance in wargaming, wargaming has many communities that tend to try to simulate fundamentally what a battle is, and and that's great because, for example, I also use lots of let's say of wargaming books sometimes, but the point is just to gain an information about that particular historical detail, but then you don't really think that, I think I've never played a war game in the unless it wasn't something very well, it depends. I will tell you maybe one day about this, but the concept is that the more you tend to arrange it, and the more basically you tend to simplify it. So what wargaming actually doesn't do, and that many do not realize while they think of it, is that they don't actually try to amplify the complexity of a military system, but just to reduce it to certain tiny approximate variables that at the end of the day are taking away the realism in the same moment in which you apply them. So sadly enough, there will never be anything like a real combat simulator for saying, this, and no computer will ever manage to calculate things like the outcome of a war. I mean, there can be certain predictions that obviously can happen. Strategical analysts, at least the real good ones, are there for that reason. But it's still something that we know from that very same analysis that actually doesn't work, or at least it has a lot of limitations, right? And you simply do not know because you can't figure it out. Even something to make it more banal. Think about the weather, meteorology. Meteorology is not a science; it's fundamentally an art, maybe as well, in the sense that you don't really know. I mean, you have a lot of physical data, right? You collect from the physical world, but at the end of the day, no meteorologist has the perfect exact certainty of what weather will be that day precisely, just by the strict perfect number of temperature, wind speed, presence of clouds, and all this stuff. Because it turns out that even that system is extremely complicated, physically speaking. So you can imagine something like war, where there are entire nations at war, of millions of people and different minds and different situations, a lot of other variable factors. So that's why rightfully von Clausewitz states that a war is effectively the human activity with the highest degree of uncertainty in the outcome. And it's perfectly realistic assessment, and that's what all the Vom Kriege in many ways is really about. It's trying to make you understand that there is no scientific way to get to know how to win a war, but there are certain practical and just, let's say, to make it more effective, that the only assessment of this reality is gonna give you a sort of edge for what it can really matter in the fight of a war, right? At the same time, it also should make you reflect on how really war is fought most of the times really by these dynamics, without people even most of the times going far straight from that, because it's as if our political, social, and military systems were already set fundamentally on those standards, because there is a pressure of elements that have to do even with the object chiefly, and the fear and exactly this unpredictability that, although people would like to eliminate or to approximate, actually is always there. And then where it comes the moment of action, people are instinctively brought at least to think about their survival, to think faster, and therefore on average coming up with better solutions. So this is particularly important in my opinion, and it should be really understood deeply at a very broad level, I think, in our society, because otherwise because this can be applied to everything in our society in many ways. I mean, as long as it can be applied even mathematically to complex systems that show you that things are extremely complicated, and that there is even a problem in pretending that the difficulty into calculating that is not part of the economical effort you're making. to get to that acknowledgement, right? Well, that's a thing to reflect on. Then von Clausewitz says, but even those combats which, as subordinate acts, are in the strict sense devoted to the destruction of the enemy's fighting force, need to have that destruction itself as their first object. So here it comes a little back on track to really refresh your mind, saying, yeah, we have analyzed how this complicated it is, but still, all these smaller units, even, you would think they're not so significant, or maybe they're so indirect in terms of sheer destruction of enemy force, but they're still combats as themselves, and they always have as their first object the destruction of the enemy's fighting force in this concept. That is to say that that just to make a banal example, let's imagine you have to it's as if it's the difference that passes, let's say, between a guy that let's assume is going into a covert operation, and one of the main objectives, because that's really what can allow victory, is not to be spotted. And the first thing he does when he sees an enemy is, an enemy, and start boom, 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 and firing and waking up the whole enemy base or something like that. Well, that's the point. You have to get around sometimes the mere face-to-face confrontation to achieve, however, the same destruction of the enemy at the end of the day. That's what the point is, and you can't say that in war this gets constantly passed by. For instance, think about symmetric warfare. Symmetric warfare is a myth. There is by no real standard any conflict that is something like symmetric. Because guess what? War is asymmetric by definition. If anything, because the combatants are always starting from different conditions, and you can't pretend that at that point you can't physically have, like a guy impacting perfectly against the other, the same force with the same... it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's not real. You can use it to fuel your fantasies if you like such theoretical plays, but just know that's not how winning wars is done. It on the contrary is in fact its exact opposite, right? So that's why I could start my rants against things like the deadliest warrior bullshit stuff. That's exactly what I have in mind right now. But because it's full of people who can go out there, including me, saying, okay, let's look at this part of military history and let's tell the story. But sometimes it's just about repeating the story, not really understanding these essentials, let's say, of how you should conceive the story in the first place. And this tendency to oversimplification, it's actually a serious thing. It's also how, in part, we need to cope with reality. The same von Clausewitz told us, astonishingly, in the first chapter. Basically, humans do everything but, behaving rationally, taking rational decisions, and with all the consequences of the case. But nevertheless, this is what reality is about, and therefore you have to be able to at least rationalize this and to try to push into that direction. So it's something really counterintuitive, and that's why these prejudices are so widespread, because your mind automatically wouldn't think about it. It would simply make the same mechanism, perhaps, but just in reverse. And what it doesn't understand is that it's the other way around. That serves the purpose. And interestingly enough, maybe let's not digress into this because it's too complicated, but just reflect on how still wars are really fought by those armed forces, by those people, in the way that von Clausewitz says. So it's as if the individual in this sense had less it had no capability to conceive this, at least very simply. And then when human groups do these things, they actually correspond to these dynamics, more or less, with a relatively low degree of irrationality, given what instead the individual perspective is often about. That's also, we'll have to see this more in detail when von Clausewitz makes the list of all the soldiers' psychological profiles, a list that deals exactly with this. That is, that there are certain qualities of that are required to fighters that perform certain type of tasks, while the others have to be different, because it's a very diversified activity as well. But it's always diversifies itself, let's say, along the way. That's what it also was trying to tell us. Then here, it's particularly, let's repeat the last phrase because I believe it's important. But even those combats which, as subordinate acts, are in the strict sense devoted to the destruction of the enemy's fighting force, need not have that destruction itself as their first object. So yeah, I think I messed up something during the explanation, but I think the sense is actually the same. That is to say, the destruction here is meant to say the face-to-face thing. You have to pass behind, right? So okay, and let me see if I messed up something else, but I don't think so. Destruction first option. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. The explanation turned out actually correct. So it was just a linguistical lapsus, let's say, but the concept is safe. So then going on, if we think of the manifold parts of a great armed force, of the number of circumstances which come into activity when it is employed, then it is clear that the combat of such a force must also require manifold organization, a subordinating of parts and formation, right? So here von Clausewitz gets into a bit more in the details, in the practical side, and he repeats what we said before about how armed forces are structured, right? And that is to say, this reflects the various, it stems from the required flexibility of war, right? You need to cope with most of the threats as possible, right? Always given that, obviously, you don't have literally to think of all the possible threats, but let's say just the most likely ones, right? Or at least to calibrate your organization and all of the units that make up your armed forces in a way that they can cope with that, So in this sense, feels like organics or other change, they are very important to understand in their functionment, because especially when they act on the field, and it's way more machinos and also here counterintuitive, that organic also kind of floats that this ideal organization, in fact, is presented even in wargaming, like the standard thing, like that unit is exactly that same kind of number, because that it is, and those soldiers are equipped just with that specific way. It really doesn't. It's a form of approximation, because it doesn't take into consideration, for example, that army sizes fluctuate constantly, or that soldiers really fight with everything they have, that even a weapon is basically one of the least important elements of how a combat is carried out. So, and how these troops are capable of adapting. That's why even the let's say the deadliest warrior's approach, let's call it in this way, is senseless, because once that you acknowledge that the enemy has some strengths and you some weaknesses, you try to balance that, at least in that particular field, in ways that make you abandon those weaknesses. In other words, if you approach an enemy that you know has a terrible weapon with him and that you can't cope with your usual tactics, you have to formulate something else. So it really doesn't, we can't stress enough how theoretical such ideals are at the end of the day. And I think it's really important. And so this entails also the organizational phase proper, that obviously doesn't just have to do with organic, but the whole system, how it works, logistically speaking, and the drawing of resources from somewhere else, wherever it can be. So, but this is still kind of more detailed. Let's go on to the track now. Then it says there may and must naturally arise for particular parts of a number of objects which are not themselves the destruction of the enemy's armed force, and which, while they certainly contribute to increase that destruction, do so in an indirect manner. If a battalion is ordered to drive the enemy, let's stop in here, wait. I was thinking about something else, sorry. Destruction the enemy is armed force, essentially contribute because the destruction is only in indirect manner. Yeah, so this also is something we already repeated before. That is, we already said before, that is, you don't have directly, to punch the enemy face to knock him out, because that, for example, could expose you unnecessarily. While if you sneak from his flank and you are able to catch him by surprise, you can achieve much greater results. So that's pretty obvious. But even to get there, you may, this could even happen theoretically without a fight. Like, it's, think about position warfare. Like, there were moments in history in which, in fact, you wouldn't even go against an enemy if he had a particularly advantageous position, because you knew that at that point, it really didn't work. Actually, humans always found out ways to break this. So obviously, this gives you even dimensionally how complicated and how many ways can be found. Human ingenuity is extraordinary under pressure, like in episodes like war. So, but it's still important to bear in mind that even the direct confrontation is actually most of the times not really what you're looking for in the first place, because otherwise we have talked a lot about the suspension of the action, etc., all this stuff that is intrinsic to human nature in many ways, right? So going on, if a battalion is ordered to drive the enemy from a rising ground or a bridge, etc., then properly the occupation of any such locality is the real object, the destruction of the enemy's armed force, which takes place only the means or secondary matter, right? So this is particularly important, because it's exactly what we were telling before. If you take an elevated ground or a bridge or somewhere that gives you this tactical edge fundamentally on the enemy, and this can go far beyond, because sometimes taking that, it doesn't even mean, in fact, that it's really what concerns the combat locally speaking. Taking a higher ground or a bridge, even as small as can be. Think about Hougoumont at Waterloo. It's not that, the fight that happened there was something confined to there, because, the French had to commit an enormous amount of forces at that point that were distracted from elsewhere, to consume the resources, and that had an effect on all over the field, even on places that maybe were not even in sight of Hougoumont at that point. So that's why it's important, because it's not really about destroying the enemy soldiers that are there. It's literally holding that place, that makes the difference, because obviously it had an effect of armed forces that increases or decreases their power in this sense. So you can have in many ways some objects, even in strictly say in the most military operations, in the sense that, remember the difference between political objects and military objects. There can be objects that can be very military, but they can pass through not fighting but just occupying one place. Then this obviously doesn't tell us whether you're going to fight in order to get there, or if you will fight afterwards or from there. It doesn't matter. What it matters at what point is that the objective is not going out there for massacring the enemy, but simply occupying one place, right? And that's why also objects vary a lot, right? So that here, in these occasions, the destruction of the enemy's armed force takes place only the means or secondary matter. It can pass literally in the foreground, in the background, sorry, and in the foreground you have instead this necessity of occupying that position. So that's why sometimes even people who maybe naively think that I don't know, so many dead people for one stupid place, and thinking that taking that place is somehow an act of lunacy for which thousands of lives have to perish. Well, that's not the point, and I believe actually there are very few people who are so naive to think that that objective is not important. One thing is a wrong military decision, that is to say, maybe identifying one object that actually requires a lot of sacrifice, but in this sense is not maybe it's not right because it comes from a miscalculation, etc. But even this relatively insignificant places or objects that appear to us as the cemetery for so many soldiers in fight, it's still not it's still part of a greater plan. And it's embarrassing in this sense how I think pacifist culture has is fundamentally all about this, because it doesn't even try to make 2 plus 2 and arrive to the result. They just stop to the 2, maybe to the plus or to the 2, and don't see the broader picture, that is to make 4. This is important because I believe that any criticism in that direction is simply deriving from plain ignorance. That is to say, you don't realize that something can be important because objectively reality is very complex, and objectives can pass from such things, but that's when you have let's say the evidence that that person doesn't consider the whole thing because simply doesn't know about it. That's the real point. So never take that. This phrase also explains to you better why von Clausewitz thinks so much about feels the need of proving that an action is not irrational, that there is not a counter, there is not a mistake, that there is not an incongruency, in a contradiction, he calls that, into such aspects of warfare. Because you may think, that attacking is just the best way. It doesn't matter. Like blind charge against the enemy, that's all you would have to think about. And that's, interestingly enough, why, for example, some conflicts in our history are so they have this stigma attached. Like, think about World War I. I mean, I think there is a common conception about the First World War that is about, like, those greedy politicians and bloodthirsty generals who just sent a whole generation of young people to die ultimately for no reason. This idea that, the senseless slaughter, it's a bit difficult to, okay, that was a moment in which you could really impose a lot to the masses through certain means, but you can't read politically, even before the military, a conflict like World War I, if you stop to the fact that, people died and that maybe it was not worth it. It can't happen that wars are fought and they're not worth it. And part of this obviously has to do with how, results really didn't match the expectations. And definitely World War I is a moment in which those expectations were really more far than other times in history from the results, right? But at the same time, there is always a logic that is underneath that. And as ugly as it can be, as many millions that it can cause in terms of deaths and kills in general, is something you should try to understand, at least from the ground. For instance, doctrine in World War I, after 2 or 3 months of war, was already suited to trench warfare. I mean, it's not that during World War I, what you had is just generals trying to go, sending men against enemy machine guns because they didn't understand how it worked. They perfectly understood it. It's simply that, warfare, that there weren't other ways to break that. And that obviously is horrifying, subjectively, but at the same time it was the only way to break through and to achieve something that at that point was politically wanted. So it's not really about the instrument at that point, a war of the military instrument. It's really how, committed such sides were to go on and to even lose much, not just obviously on the to risk much, at least not only in on the field but also at home, which is actually the same thing, because it's always the same place. So it's I think this reflection deserves some deepening, because said in this way sounds like as if it was fine to have had World War I. Obviously it wasn't, but there are still ways in which the story is told that really do not render justice to human civilization at that point, because you don't really think humans are that stupid when they do certain things not to know that they're doing it wrong. And I know that human stupidity now is pretty much out there, but humans can't be as stupid as intelligent as they can be, really. And the problem is that this doesn't really happen most of the times in which side you take, but really it's still as if it was the same, the face of the double face says of one metal, right? But let's close this, because for now we're digressing too much at this point. But I don't even remember why we started this. But okay, and just for saying, the sacrifice of human life is sometimes a mean to reach the destruction of fighting capabilities, or at least to make the enemy stop fighting. Right. So, going on, if the enemy can be driven away merely by a demonstration, the object is attained all the same. This is the point. That is to say, you can even show how stupidly brave you are to intimidate someone. And sometimes it worked. This is a paradox, historically speaking. Obviously, it's not very likely to have happened, but demonstrations can be, say, as effective as even to fighting itself. For example, he says, this hill or bridge is in point of fact only required as a means of increasing the gross amount of loss inflicted to the enemy's armored force, at least in theory. So occupying that favorable tactical position is a way to, at least in perspective, render maybe the losses to attack that place too high for the enemy's commitment to go on, to carry on fighting, right? And it really happens most of the time. I mean, really, warfare is all about this. That's how you are you can, let's say, get to a settlement, because we have seen it. It's very economically conceived, right? If the costs surpass the benefits, at one point there is not even need to fight. And these secondary objectives can be, in this sense, more important than the destruction of the enemy force. That's the point. That's the whole point of the story. The fighting capabilities are something else, because they depend on the commitment as well, not just on the resources or the sheer physical destruction in the end. And for Clausewitz says, it is the case on the field of battle, much more must it be so on the whole theatre of war, where not only one army is opposed to another, but one state, one nation, one whole country to another. Here the number of possible relations and consequently possible combinations is much greater. The diversity of measures increased, and by the gradation of objects, each subordinate to another, the first means employed is further apart from the ultimate object. So this is also an extremely meaningful phrase, because it tells you that not only this happens in the same dynamic, both on battlefield at a smaller tactical scale and at the grand strategy level, let's say. But there is a difference, not just in scale, but also in complexity in this sense, because it's way more, let's say, it's way easier or better, and there are way more options to achieve the destruction of enemy fighting capabilities in with a bigger decision than a smaller one. Explain myself better. That's a reason, for example, why tactics is way simpler to understand than strategy, right? Because tactics is, once you get the essentials of how armies fight on the field, usually that's something you can approximate theoretically, right? And that's why wargame sometimes really deals with that, also because it's apparently more picturesque, because you see actually the thing visually, right? You can't see a battlefield, you can't see an army. When it gets to strategy, things get not only apparently more boring, actually instinctively, but they become actually way more complicated, way more difficult. And this is a freaking serious deal, because as we were saying at the beginning of the video, what you need on the higher ranks is more intelligence than enjoyment, because you get closer to policy actually than the military. So that's what it was. The military embodies in Clausewitzian Trinity the game, right? So something you do, even like, okay, we know there is a risk, but let's go out there and see what happens, because theoretically less is a stake, or at least there is a higher degree of intelligibility of the outcome. In the higher ranks in strategy, that's terrifyingly complex and complicated, and sometimes, actually most of the times, it's even way more difficult to have a realistic grasp. It's a bit like in history, like when you study something in detail, everything is saying, oh well, when we know so much about this, but when you look at this larger scale, you look at things like that can even serve, strategically speaking, like the population of a country, or the size of the economy, and you realize that there is no structural evidence of that, or at least there is much less than what you had proportionally in detail. So the real problem is that it is true that there are way more options in strategy than in tactics, but at the same time, there is also much less to be known with precision in strategy than in tactics, right? So this is particularly meaningful because it has to do even with the way we approach this instinctively. That is to say, remember where von Clausewitz says that human mind tries to stay away from difficulty, because if something is too hard, well, I don't want to do it now, let's delay it, hoping that the problem will solve by itself. Well, this is a human tendency, and von Clausewitz is obviously for pushing in the same exact opposite direction. That is, you should always keep fit, and by the foundations of the theory of war, you should always push from the other side, should always be kind of not really over the top, but still at the top. You should always counter this in intrinsic human laziness and idleness for being more active, right, and not to relax. Well, that's what strategy in itself discourages. By the way, incidentally, that's why I like tactics more, and I kind of, and it's also something I invested more into it, because it's, just thinking about making a YouTube videos about not tactics but strategy. That would be way more boring, because it would be, first of all, way more difficult to make them. Secondly, it would be extremely more difficult to follow them. And as a consequence, people wouldn't like that. Instead, people like things like swords and shields smashing against each other, because it's very filming. It's picturesque. It's spectacular, right? And so that, for example, can give you the dimension, which is and there is a very big difference in potential relatively to this. I mean, really, it takes really, and that's why I would say even the military in itself doesn't quite have a clear understanding about military history, for example, because you can be someone who is perfectly trained to take action, maybe, let's say, at a platoon level, or maybe a company level. You have this abilities, etc. By the way, every human mind is usually best suited for a certain level of combat, for which, at a lower one and at a higher one, it might not be good. That is to say, you can have an excellent soldier that would be a completely incapable general, and vice versa, right? And it's way more common to find courage for being a soldier than intelligence for being a general, right? And that's what makes things difficult, and that's why society is hierarchical also, by the way, and that's why organic is hierarchical, and that's why there is a chain of command that proceeds from the one to down to more elements. So it's all about this. So you see how actually Clausewitzian thought is so it really tells you the world that talks to you about the whole dimension of war, or the infinite dimensions of war, actually, and because everything also reflects on each other. So once you get acquainted with his way of thinking and the way he explains that, and the examples he makes, you realize that it actually has a crystalline mind, an extremely pure mind, that really shows you thread by thread how this whole thing is really working. And that's the incredible nature of Clausewitzian theory that I personally, I don't know actually any other thinker that at least, of course, I believe that were more relatively more refined thinkers, but this is, wow, I mean, this was a single mind thinking this. It's incredible. Obviously, with a lot of experience, also, as he says, by talking with lots of other soldiers and veterans, etc. But still, being able to make a synthesis of this it's extraordinary. So, really, really fantastic, in my opinion. So, And this is, by the way, also one of the reasons why war is something relatively rare as a political option in the first place. I mean, historically speaking, you can't say that we have been living in a world of war to emphasize the fact that, yeah, wars exist, they're important, they're traumatic, they have. But if you look at the entire history of mankind, you realize that for how many wars there could be, there were at least many times more periods of peace, if anything, to prepare for another war, because sometimes it was so exhausting there couldn't be another way around it. So it's there is still a suspension in the act of war that always remembered is just the escalation of a much deeper conflict that is actually always there. I mean, it never disappears. It's you can't really. One of the most difficult things to do in absolute terms in military, at least in telling military history, about military history, but also making it, because it's still meaningful for what it entails in procedure, in the research proper, is to find a starting point. Because people could say, well, if I have to study a war or a battle, I just start from the day in which it started. Well, no, because if you were to do it, you wouldn't know anything about the reasons, about the moral forces, about how that army was put to place, what other characters were influencing that army from before. You wouldn't understand how it went. So that's the difference, by the way, between studying military history and history of the military art proper, because you can study war as a sort of abstract entity that maybe affects some parts of it that you anatomically try to, actually not anatomically, because it means something the same exact opposite, but let's say you surgically extrapolate just to consider on their own. Another thing is seeing how war is effectively waged, because at the end of the day, what's the sense of studying war if you are not studying how it is effectively waged? At that point, it's not about about war anymore. I mean, it's about things that are interact with war, but that you can't fully understand even themselves, because if you don't know how that works, it's just like something like a context, like a background, something you choose to take into consideration because it's about war, but it's not really war in itself. So it's yes, and conflict has always its war has always deeper roots in conflict that are as old as mankind, as you can say. Because you could explain all this just by observing that we are molded in a certain way genetically, and we react to the surrounding element with a certain degree of aggressiveness that is counterbalanced naturally by other qualities of kind of tolerance and type, but it's still swinging between these extremes, and that cannot be eliminated. And it turns out that in fact what happens in reality is around the middle of these extremes. It's like with even Von Clausewitz showed us, he tells us that lots of things control and modify war as an act of violence, and it is true of every single days of our lives, because we're constantly violent in some ways. I mean, even by speaking right now, I'm being violent. There are certain philosophies that basically state that even talking is a sort of way of fighting at the same time. It is true, because dialectics, it does definitely entail some polemical elements into it. Even rhetoric that is aimed at convincing rather than it's still kind of a positive in some ways, because it wants to reverse, but at least it kind of mitigates and counterbalance. So it's all a strategy, if you want. It's all about strategy, and that's all about complex systems, right? So that's what makes all of this so great, right? the okay, so many other considerations, but we can talk about this forever. So going on, it is therefore for many reasons possible that the object of a combat is not the destruction of the enemy's force, that is, of the force immediately opposed to us, but that this only appears as a means, right? But in all such cases, it's no longer a question of complete destruction, for the combat here is nothing else but a measure of strength, has in itself no value except only that of the present result, that is, of its decision. Now, this is also an extremely important, my god, how much this man has been able to conceive. I mean, this is really deep, because it really talks about this mechanism that we have seen, this unit, this combat, has he put that in relation with the present. That is to say, that is to stress powerfully, first of all, how situation here, he's not explicit about this, but he's really entailing it indirectly, that everything changes, right? And this relation between the subject and the object is always about the decision to take. I mean, it's obviously also about the action to take as a consequence, but it's something we keep in mind, because we have to calculate constantly the variables of this system. It's as if, let's assume, think about the angle of fire. You know, the more if you move in a certain way, if you have to readjust the fire constantly, right? And it's something you can do. You can train yourself to do it, and it's the same exact thing. So it's as if even the act of violence in itself was subordinated to this eternal dialectics existing between subject and object, which goes far beyond war. It's something that has to do with the way we act in reality. We behave, and we take decisions, and we try to solve problems. It's all about this, really. And so in this way, that the example of the angle of fire is particularly fascinating, because at that point what you're really focused on is not the fact that you're firing. It's the fact that you have to keep the aim straight. Do you understand? Look, when I say that von Clausewitz is a genius, you understand now why I'm saying this. I mean, if you had already not, gotten it, that's really about this. It's really about saying that, and as a consequence, do you realize, for example, what this phrase entails? That, for example, killing someone is subordinated to something else, and this has enormous philosophical implications, because we live in a world that obviously, for example, attributes an intrinsic value to human life, or at least to certain potential attached to human life, if we want to be more precise, but it's basically the same thing. So the question is, what do we live like in a world where basically everything depends on a single absolute factor that turns out it's not realistic in itself, or do we try to calibrate the system accordingly? I mean, even now, I don't want to really go into to law or to ethics, into this stuff, but or in religion, but it's always about the importance of responsibility. That is to say that a fixed solution doesn't exist. In life, the real problem is not that you have a certain set of standards that you can't say, well, okay, we'll stay to those and everything is fine. The real problem is attaining those, staying to those standards. That's the real challenge. That's where all the problem stands. It's like knowing that there is the right thing to do, but not doing it. Because it turns out most of the time it's the hardest thing to do. That's like, so it's as if life was a duty to calculate this choice. That is to say, there is no easy way out of this. You can't say, it's just like with reason. I believe, for example, that a good deal of good, if not all good, actually derives from a perfect reason. I mean, there are even many religious conceptions that are this. I mean, think about, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas. What the whole thing is about, taking Aristotle's rationalism, applying to the idea of the unmoved mover with perfect reason and perfectly logical, perfectly coherent, but the problem is that reason is as a human quality, ability, at least, or function. But this function has to be exercised. You can't pretend that as soon as you're born and you learn about something, that first of all, that learning about that something came from out of nowhere. It actually, since the moment you were born, or even before for that matter, you are fundamentally struggling. And we all struggle. I do believe, personally, I believe that life is mostly struggling, which doesn't mean that, we should kill ourselves because of this. There are definitely certain cases that would entail that, given the gravity and the unbearability of certain situations. But at the end of the day, you have two options. Either you give up and die because you basically higher your tolerance at a level you're overwhelmed. In medicine, the maximum of tolerance equates to death, so that's pretty eloquent. Or you try to figure out the best way. In order to figure out how the best way to solve the problem, you have to exercise reason. That is to say, you have to cultivate it. And that's essentially what von Clausewitz is telling here, is that if you have an edge, that is most of the times how you figure things out. Because that approach is theoretically to the perfect scientific awareness that would be at the base of any action. This is the Vom Kriege is also about It's deeply about responsibility. It's deeply about ethics, I believe. Even if von Clausewitz stays away from that, because the way he makes you understand it is showing you that there is no way out, and that's the only conclusion in many ways. And it doesn't tell us, but he makes us understand. So that's why this is a great read as well. Even if you maybe allegedly you're not interested into war in itself, but you have an extraordinary amount to learn about human nature from the Vom Kriege. And in general, from old military history, I believe that military history is one of possibly the most useful study for anthropological ends, I believe. If you really want to understand mankind, you have to pass through here. And as ugly as it can be, indeed, but therefore, that's why I always tell you, never buy this culturalist or pacifist or other sort of, of perspectives that tend just to moralistically, dismiss everything just because, they don't want to make the intellectual effort to get there. Because those are intrinsically irresponsible positions. They have no grounding to reality. They're just emotional reactions. They're nothing concrete. If we have something that really changes us, that really differentiates us from our other beings, is reason. And through reason, we have achieved a freaking lot of things. I would have the courage to take it as far to say for good, right? Because I believe that reason has good, and I believe that the humankind is good and evil as it can be, but it's prevalently good. That is to say, it will always make evil, but at least the potential that humankind has to make good is much higher than the one it has to make evil. That's what I truly believe. And I don't just say it, even, psychiatry tells us, even, genetics tells us. I mean, it's really, it's written in ourselves. And I discovered lots of these perspectives even by just reading the Vom Kriege, and I think it can help. Obviously, you can't get this from elsewhere, but the Vom Kriege has this ability of condensating that there is no writer anymore, no thinker anymore writes or expresses himself in this fashion with this greater. These are hundreds and hundreds of pages of essentially to express all one concept. Definitely. I'm way more concise than Von Clausewitz. When you tell me, you make videos that last hours and they're long. Well, I try in my extremely modest means to talk about this in this bit of the same way, in a much more confusionary and disordered way, because I'm absolutely I'm not very a disordered person much, but I do have difficulties. It obviously stemmed from the fact that my reason is not as exercised as from Clausewitz one, and that actually no one's mind of people that I know, at least, is right. So that's why I talk about him so gladly, and why I decide to talk about him on Schwerpunkt. So going on, I think we arrived in here. Okay. I think we had to read this, but yes, a measuring of strength may be affected in cases where the opposing sides are very unequal by a mere comparative estimate. In such cases, no fighting will take place, and the weaker will immediately give way. So yeah, in here it's an elementary phrase. I mean, it's obvious that if it's about the costs-benefits ratio, right? If the costs surpass the benefits, you stop fighting, or at least you try to desist, and maybe the enemy keeps pressing on you, and that's a great problem as well. But that's what essentially this phrase means, and or at least there is a broader implication, perhaps, is exactly this, that here it says the weaker will immediately give way. This is interesting because it's really how it works even in human groups on the battlefield. Like it goes really, you could say, relatively mechanically for how complicated it actually is in terms of the system, but that's where it gets relatively easy to understand certain things that work on the single battlefield, like on at a planetary scale, like during a world war, like things like masses, unity of command, moral, etc. All think about also all the principles of war. That's something that works in the same old way. A greater force can make a greater effect on another, and if this difference is very very big, obviously the weaker side will tend to get away, right, in one way or another. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, if the object of a combat is not always the destruction of the enemy's forces therein engaged, and if its object can often be attained as well without the combat taking place at all, by merely making a resolve to fight, and by the circumstances to which this resolution gives rise, then that explains how a whole campaign may be carried on with a great activity without the actual combat playing any notable part in it. So this is also very, very important, because in his stressing, in some ways, that quest for rationality we were telling before. That is to say, if you have really planned things well, ideally, let's say, and you have a strong will, and you know what you have to do, you may achieve certain degree of of superiority over the enemy, that the enemy may not have even the need to combat, to fight, or that combat that obviously always exists in terms of war. I mean, wars that which nobody has ever been even killed are pretty rare, or non-existent actually. Well, still combat may have a quite relative importance into it, and that's there are many examples, historically speaking, of this, of conquests that were actually fairly easy, that looked like, more like walks into an enemy, to a foreign country than the invasion of one, and because simply it was a few resistance. The one that existed was crushed, but the mere difference in potential at this point was enough, even though for having a very few. Think about when the Germans entered in Austria in 1938. Well, I think the only active resistance at that point was at the Theresian Academy, that the cadets basically didn't let the Germans in for some days. Then eventually they gave up, and that's a beautiful case of how that tells you, especially in that case, how much politics had to do, even with certain. In that case, there was a government that wanted to maintain its sovereignty, etc. Then there was a people that largely sympathized, or at least that had some interest with the Germans for the Anschluss. So that's an example of shows you how it can happen. But at that point, there were also kind of weak motives for one side or the other to. Obviously, from the German side, it was higher because that was seizing another country. It was all a strategical goal into it. But from the Austrian side, there were not many political reasons to resist, and not right. So that's the point. And in fact, von Clausewitz says that obviously at that time, von Clausewitz didn't live. Unfortunately, he could have not lived so long to see that. But he states, looking at his previous history, at his times, that this may be so. Military history proves by 100 examples, right? And then going on says, how many of those cases can be justified, that is, without involving a contradiction, and whether some of the celebrities who rose out of them would stand criticism, we shall leave undecided. For all we have to do with the matter is to show the possibility of such a course of events in war. So this is a bit of a sting thing, like to some commanders, because it basically says that, and this is actually generally meant. It is that let's put it in this way: there are moments in war in which such events, like, for example, indulging into even maybe sparing the enemy's life, not necessarily fighting the weakest, like having a moment in which you say there are, if you want, irrational elements, given the objectives. Of course, sometimes leaving a prisoner alive can have good reasons, but sometimes there are other moments that in which a certain degree of irrational decisions are taken, and Saint von Clausewitz explained that in the first chapter, that it happens actually very often. But at that point, we have to distinguish whether these actions in fact were rationally or irrationally driven, first of all. And here is things those people say, that there are many generals that maybe do something wrong, so here is entailing it that maybe will not stand criticism, so you can't really ask them. And von Clausewitz definitely knew about this, because he had evidently already that it had happened to some people he knew, at least, maybe to himself, who knows. And the for sure, actually, but given the importance even of certain decisions, that, however, showed us that this system has no contradiction, really, and the that there is no way for which you really have exclusively to fight against the enemy face to face in order to defeat them. This is, at the end of the day, the real point. So, yeah, I mean, as you understand, it's difficult to explain it, because I obviously am not so prepared, but also I definitely it's really the subject matter that has a great complexity in itself. Even von Clausewitz jumps from not really from one place to another, because we see that he's pretty consequential and he really makes points very firmly, but sometimes it's difficult for you, by reading him, to bear in mind literally everything, and trying to grasp even these subtle lines sometimes he had to make you understand better, say, every single point. And okay, and for now we stop, because as you listen, I'm exhausted. I shouldn't make videos for more than 2 hours long, because it's really tiring, but sometimes you have to take it to the next step, because otherwise I like to get step by step, even without cutting important elements from, because von Clausewitz here, this part of the Vom Kriege is not organized in I mean, it has very long paragraphs that have no smaller subdivision, and therefore it would be too long to make a video on the whole paragraph, because it would take like 20 hours or even more, actually. But it's still, if you read it carefully, you can still spot there are some sort of sub-partitions, as certain translations or editions actually have this subdivision, and therefore you can make the frog jump, reading chunk by chunk in sequence, and that's more useful. So, but it's important to get acquainted with the author, with the style of writing, with the style of reasoning, and the general thinking, of course, that obviously, however, can be understood only if you go step by step. It's not easy to follow him if you're not used, but the more you do it, the more you train yourself, the more it emerges. And it's beautiful, because it's as if your mind fluidified. I mean, even when I started to make this series, I knew much less. I mean, every time I started the video, I said, "Oh my God, what do you have to say now?" Now it's fairly easy. Even understanding the language, the idea, I always actually read it before in other languages, because I like to read different translations to get kind of better, a deeper semantic perspective, at least, of what he's really saying. Obviously, starting from German, because that's what you should not even read but study him from. And it's particularly meaningful in the way it's been for me, actually, because the main that's something you can test on yourself, and I can tell you, at least from this perspective, what kind of sensation there is, and of feeling you have when you study from Clausewitz, in progressively, and how you widen your horizons by listening to him, right? Okay, so for now, let's finish it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.